The city buzzed with the usual rhythm of the night cars humming down the highway, neon signs flickering in the distance, and the murmur of distant conversations bleeding into the air. It was the kind of night that made secrets feel heavier, like the darkness itself was pressing in, waiting for something to be revealed. Somewhere in the heart of it all, a phone rang, cutting through the stillness of a dimly lit newsroom where a tired journalist leaned back in his chair, half listening to the static on the other end. It had been a slow day, nothing but recycled headlines and the same old narratives being pushed, but this call was different. The voice on the other end was low, cautious, almost hesitant, as if weighing every word before speaking. "I have something you need to hear. Something about Errol Spence Jr. But you have to promise me you won't ignore this." The name alone was enough to straighten his posture, eyes narrowing as he reached for a notepad. Errol Spence Jr., the undefeated champion, the warrior in the ring, the man who had survived one of the most brutal car crashes in recent sports history. What could someone possibly have to say about him that hadn't already been dissected in 100 different articles? But something about the caller's voice, the way it wavered between urgency and restraint, made it impossible to dismiss. "Go on," he said, gripping the pen tighter. The voice hesitated again, and then, almost as if forcing the words out, the caller whispered, "His injury. It's not what they told you. It's worse. A lot worse." A chill ran down his spine, but before he could ask anything more, the line went dead, leaving only the hollow silence of a conversation unfinished. He stared at the phone, his pulse quickening. What did that mean? Everyone had seen the footage of that horrifying crash, Spence's Ferrari flipping uncontrollably, glass and metal scattering like broken dreams across the asphalt. And yet, miraculously, he had survived. No broken bones, no major fractures, only a few facial lacerations and a miraculous recovery that had defied every expectation. He had come back stronger, faster, more determined. But now, someone was suggesting that the truth wasn't as clean as it seemed. The journalist's mind raced through the possibilities. Had Spence been hiding something? Had his team covered up the true extent of his injuries? Or was this some elaborate ploy, a distraction crafted by those who wanted to see him fall? The only way to find out was to dig deeper. He reached for his laptop, fingers flying across the keyboard as he pulled up every interview, every medical report, every detail he could find. The official story was airtight, too airtight. No discrepancies, no lingering questions. But if the caller was right, then somewhere beneath the surface, the truth was buried. The next morning, he set out to follow the only lead he had, a former gym insider who had once been close to Spence's camp. It took some persuasion, a few calls to old contacts, but finally, he was standing outside a small CAF on the outskirts of town, watching as a man in a worn-out hoodie and dark sunglasses slid into the seat across from him. "You shouldn't be asking these questions," the man muttered, stirring his coffee absently. "It's not safe." "Then why did someone call me?" the journalist pressed. "Why tell me his injury is worse if no one wants the truth out?" The man exhaled slowly, shaking his head as if debating whether to say more. "Because not everyone in his camp agrees with how things have been handled. Look, Spence is a warrior. No one's questioning that. But what happened to him, what he went through? It left scars you can't see. And if people really found out, it would change everything." A sinking feeling settled in the journalist's stomach. "What kind of scars?" he asked, voice lower now, bracing for an answer he wasn't sure he wanted to hear. The man hesitated again, fingers tightening around the coffee cup. "You need to understand something. Boxing isn't just about what happens in the ring. It's about money, power, perception. The second you show weakness, they move on. Fighters don't get second chances. So when Spence came back, he had to prove he was still that guy. That nothing had changed. But..." He trailed off, staring down at the table before finally meeting the journalist's gaze. Something did change. And if you really want the truth, you're not gonna find it in a press release. The weight of those words settled heavy in the air, but before the journalist could press further, the man stood abruptly. "This is as much as I can tell you," he muttered. "If you keep pushing, you might not like what you find." And just like that, he was gone, disappearing into the crowd as if he had never been there at all. The journalist sat there for a long moment, the words echoing in his mind. Scars you can't see. Something did change. It wasn't enough. He needed more. And there was only one person who could answer the questions swirling in his head. Errol Spence Jr. himself. But getting to him wouldn't be easy. His camp was airtight, his circle small. No one got close unless he wanted them to. And even if he did manage to get in, there was no telling if Spence would give him the truth or just another version of the story everyone else had already heard. Still, something about that phone call, about the way the man in the CAF had spoken, made it impossible to walk away now. He had started down this path, and there was no turning back. As he walked out of the CAF, pulling his jacket tighter against the wind, he didn't notice the dark car parked across the street, the figure inside watching his every move. He didn't see the way the man inside lifted a phone to his ear, speaking in hushed tones before driving off into the night. Because while he was chasing the truth, someone else was making sure it stayed buried. The night air carried a strange weight as the journalist walked away from the CAF, his mind racing with the pieces of a puzzle he wasn't sure he should be solving. Something about the way the informant had spoken clipped, cautious, like he was saying too much without saying enough, left an unease in his chest. The world knew Errol Spence Jr. as the relentless fighter, the miracle man who had walked away from a crash that should have ended everything. The comeback story had been airtight, no questions left unanswered. Or so it seemed. But now, with this anonymous call and a reluctant informant whispering about scars unseen, the journalist couldn't shake the feeling that something had been carefully constructed, a reality shaped to fit a narrative people wanted to believe. And that meant someone had a lot to lose if the truth ever surfaced. As he walked toward his car, parked just a block away, he took in his surroundings, suddenly aware of every passing figure, every car idling a second too long at the intersection. Paranoia crept in, but he forced it down. This was just a story, one that needed to be told. But the moment he reached for the driver's side door handle, a chill prickled down his spine. Across the street, beneath a flickering streetlight, a dark sedan sat motionless, engine running. The windows were tinted, obscuring whoever was inside, but he knew, without a doubt, that someone was watching him. He pretended not to notice, slipping into his car with practiced ease, but his hands gripped the wheel a little too tight. He waited, letting the tension stretch, but the sedan never moved. His pulse hammered, thoughts scrambling. Was it a coincidence? A random car on a random street? Or had he already stepped into something he wasn't meant to? The engine rumbled beneath his fingers as he pulled away, heart pounding when the sedan didn't follow. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe he was just getting in his own head. But the feeling didn't leave, not even when he was miles away, parking outside his small apartment. Inside, he locked the door, checking it twice before tossing his keys onto the table. His laptop sat open where he had left it, the tabs still filled with articles, interviews, and medical reports about Spence's crash. Everything he had dug up so far pointed to one thing: a miracle recovery. No fractures. No major internal damage. No signs of lingering issues. But the problem wasn't what was there, it was what wasn't. The official story had been so polished, so devoid of inconsistencies, that it felt unnatural. It was too perfect. A man doesn't walk away from a crash like that without consequences. Not unless someone needed him to. His fingers hesitated over the keyboard before he typed a new search, one that hadn't crossed his mind until now. Errol Spence Jr. post-recovery rumors. The results were sparse, drowned in mainstream headlines of his return to the ring, but buried deep, in the forgotten corners of boxing forums and hushed online discussions, he found something unsettling. Anonymous accounts, people claiming to have seen Spence struggle in private training sessions. Whispers of doctors making house calls instead of hospital visits. One post stood out dated months after Spence's return, written by someone claiming to have worked at the gym. He looks fine under the lights, but in sparring? It's different. Something's off. He hides it well, but those close to him know. If the wrong person finds out, it's over. A lump formed in the journalist's throat. If this was true, then the implications were enormous. A fighter's career depended on perception. If Spence had been masking an injury one serious enough that it could jeopardize his ability to fight, it meant his camp had gone to great lengths to protect that secret. And now, someone was pushing for the truth to come out. But why now? And who had the most to lose? He barely got the chance to process the thought before his phone vibrated against the desk. Unknown number. His pulse spiked as he stared at the screen, debating whether to answer. He let it ring twice more before pressing it to his ear. Hello? Silence. Then a breath. Stop looking into this. The words sent a bolt of cold through his chest. The voice was different from the caller who had first tipped him off. This one was deeper, measured, carrying a weight that made it clear this wasn't a warning, it was a threat. I don't know what you're talking about, the journalist said, keeping his voice steady. You do, the voice countered. And you need to drop it. Walk away now before you make this worse for yourself. The line went dead. He exhaled sharply, his grip tightening around the phone. He had been a journalist long enough to recognize the difference between a concerned party and someone trying to silence a story. This was the latter. Which only meant one thing: he was onto something real. But if they thought a single phone call would scare him off, they didn't know him at all. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling as the weight of it all settled on his shoulders. Someone was lying. Someone powerful enough to manipulate the narrative, to make sure that whatever had happened to Errol Spence Jr. stayed buried. And the closer he got, the more dangerous it would become. But if Spence was fighting through something unseen, something no one wanted to acknowledge, then wasn't it his job to expose the truth? There was only one way to get real answers. He needed to get closer to Spence's camp. The problem was, that world was locked down, sealed tight from outsiders. If he wanted in, he'd have to be careful. And he'd have to move fast. Because if someone was already watching him, it meant they were waiting for him to slip. And he had a feeling they wouldn't warn him twice. The journalist barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, his mind replayed the voice on the phone, the low and deliberate warning that had been meant to rattle him. But fear wasn't what kept him awake. It was curiosity, the gnawing feeling that he had stumbled onto something much bigger than he had anticipated. He had chased stories before, uncovered secrets people wanted buried, but this was different. The world of boxing was ruthless, built on reputation, power, and money. If Errol Spence Jr. had been hiding an injury that could change everything about his career, then the people invested in him had a lot at stake. That meant they would do whatever it took to protect the image they had built around him. And yet, someone from the inside wanted the truth to come out. Someone had reached out to him, fed him just enough to make him look deeper. But why? Who stood to gain from revealing what had been hidden? And more importantly, who stood to lose the most? By morning, he had made up his mind. He needed to get closer, not just to Spence, but to the people around him. Fighters didn't operate alone. They had teams, trainers, managers, doctors, people who knew everything happening behind the scenes. If something was being covered up, one of them had to know. But he couldn't just walk into Spence's gym asking questions. If his presence alone raised suspicion, he'd be shut out before he even got close. He needed a way in. He spent hours making calls, reaching out to old contacts, people who had worked around fighters, trainers who had stepped away from the sport. Most didn't want to talk, brushing him off with vague answers or sudden silence. But finally, he found someone willing to listen. A former cutman, someone who had worked with Spence's camp briefly before leaving under circumstances he wouldn't explain. He agreed to meet, but only in person. No phones. No recordings. "If I see a camera, I walk," he said before hanging up. They met at an old boxing gym on the outskirts of town, a place where young fighters with nothing to lose came to sharpen their skills. The man was older, his face worn from years of working in the shadows of the sport, stitching up men who bled for a living. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "You want to know about Spence? You need to understand how this world works first," he said, his voice rough from years of shouting over the noise of the ring. "Fighters ain't just athletes. They're investments. When you've got a name as big as his, there are people who will do anything to protect it." The journalist nodded, waiting, sensing that the man was working through something in his mind, deciding how much to say. "I was there after the crash," the man finally admitted. "Not long. Just enough to see what no one was supposed to see." He exhaled, rubbing a hand over his jaw. They didn't lie about the external injuries. The cuts, the swelling that was real. But what they never told the public was that there were complications. Things they couldn't fix with stitches and time. A cold feeling settled in the journalist's stomach. "What kind of complications?" The man hesitated, then leaned in slightly. "Neurological. Balance issues. Coordination. He'd get dizzy out of nowhere. Some days he'd move like nothing ever happened. Other days he'd look like he was fighting underwater. But you think they were gonna let that get out? He was the champ. The face of boxing. The moment you admit something like that, his career is over. The money stops flowing. So they did what they had to do." The journalist's mind raced. If Spence had been struggling with something deeper than what was reported, it meant every fight since then had been a gamble, a risk that no one outside his inner circle knew about. But he passed medicals, he said, more to himself than anything else. The commissions cleared him to fight. The man let out a bitter laugh. "You think those tests tell the whole story? There's always ways around them. And even if they knew, you think they'd pull him? You know how much money is riding on his name? Boxing ain't a sport, it's a business. And in business, the truth don't matter. What matters is what people believe." The weight of the revelation settled in the journalist's chest. If this was true, then Spence had been fighting at a disadvantage all along. But how far did the cover-up go? Who else knew? He had more questions, but the man was already shaking his head. "I've said too much," he muttered. "I need to go." The journalist watched as he left, his mind a whirlwind of unanswered questions. But one thing was clear: this was bigger than he had thought. And if what he had just learned was even half true, then someone had gone to great lengths to keep it buried. But why now? Why was someone from inside his camp finally speaking out? As he walked back to his car, his phone buzzed again. Another unknown number. His stomach tightened, but he answered anyway. Silence stretched for a moment before a voice, different from the last one, spoke. "You don't know what you're getting yourself into." The call ended before he could respond. His grip tightened around the phone. They were watching him. That much was clear. But if they thought he was going to walk away now, they were wrong. Because now, more than ever, he needed to know the truth. Even if it meant putting himself in the kind of danger he wasn't sure he was ready for. The journalist sat in his car, gripping the wheel as his mind churned through the weight of the last few hours. Someone was watching him, tracking his every move, waiting for him to get too close. The second warning call hadn't been a coincidence. It had been deliberate, a clear message that he had crossed into territory he wasn't supposed to be in. But that wasn't what unsettled him the most. It was what the cut man had said, the hint of something bigger, something darker lurking beneath the surface. If Errol Spence Jr. had been dealing with balance issues, neurological damage, anything that compromised his ability to fight, then the consequences weren't just personal. It meant every fight since his return had been a carefully orchestrated risk, a gamble that no one had questioned because the illusion had been perfect. And now, someone was desperate to make sure the truth never surfaced. He took a slow breath, forcing himself to think. The official records, the public medical reports, they had all painted the same picture: full recovery, no lasting damage. But what if those reports had been manipulated? What if the medical clearances had been pushed through by people who had too much to lose? If Spence was sidelined? He needed proof, something concrete that couldn't be brushed aside. But getting that proof meant stepping even deeper into dangerous territory. He reached for his phone, scrolling through his contacts until he found the name he needed. A former ringside physician, someone who had worked within the boxing commissions before walking away, disillusioned by the politics of the sport. If anyone knew how to manipulate medical clearances, it was him. The phone rang twice before a voice answered, wary. "I was wondering when you'd call," the man said, as if he had been expecting it. The journalist stiffened. "You know why I'm calling?" A pause. "I have an idea. Meet me tonight. Usual spot." The line went dead. He exhaled, feeling the tension coil tighter. The usual spot was a dive bar on the outskirts of town, a place where off-the-record conversations happened away from prying eyes. He had met the doctor there before, back when he had been investigating smaller stories, corruption in fight matchmaking, whispers of rigged outcomes. But this wasn't about bad decisions behind the scenes. This was about a fighter's health, his future, his safety. And if the people around Spence had been willing to keep an injury quiet, it meant they were playing with something dangerous, because one wrong punch, one moment where his body betrayed him in the ring, could mean more than just losing a fight. By the time he pulled up outside the bar, the weight in his chest had only grown heavier. Inside, the place was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of alcohol and old leather seats. The doctor sat in the back, nursing a drink, eyes flicking up the moment the journalist approached. He looked tired, older than the last time they had met, like the weight of what he knew had taken its toll. "You really want to do this?" he asked, his voice quiet but firm. "Because once you open this door, you can't close it again." The journalist slid into the seat across from him. "I need to know the truth." The doctor exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "All right," he muttered. "But you're not gonna like it." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "The medical tests, the ones that cleared Spence to fight, they weren't clean. I know because I saw the real reports before they were buried. The damage was there. The neurological issues, the delayed reflexes, the potential for long-term consequences. But you think they were gonna let that stop him? There was too much money on the table, too many people invested in his return. So they did what they always do. They found the right doctors, the ones who know how to make problems disappear on paper. And just like that, he was cleared. Fit to fight. No questions asked?" The journalist's throat tightened. "And the commission let it happen?" The doctor let out a bitter laugh. "The commission turns a blind eye when the right people tell them to. This isn't new. It's been happening for years. Fighters pass tests they shouldn't. They step into the ring when they have no business being there. And the people in charge? They don't care. Because as long as the money flows, as long as the seats are filled and the pay-per-views sell, the truth doesn't matter." The journalist felt a slow burn in his chest, a mix of anger and disbelief. "So you're telling me Spence has been fighting compromised this whole time?" The doctor's expression darkened. I'm telling you, he's been fighting on borrowed time. He hesitated, glancing around the bar before lowering his voice even more. And I'm telling you, the people who made this decision? They won't let you expose it. Not without a fight. A chill ran through the journalist. He had known this was dangerous, but now he could feel the weight of just how deep it ran. This wasn't just about one fighter, one injury. This was about an entire system built to protect profits over people. And the moment he started pulling at that thread, the people holding it together would come for him. He pushed his drink aside, his pulse pounding. I need those reports. The real ones? The doctor sighed, shaking his head. You think I kept them? You think I'd risk having proof of something like this? He hesitated. But I know where they are. And I know who has them. He met the journalist's gaze. But if you go after them, if you try to get your hands on that kind of evidence, you won't just be getting phone calls anymore. His voice dropped, deadly serious. You'll be looking over your shoulder for the rest of your life. The journalist's skin prickled, but he didn't waver. Tell me where they are. The doctor exhaled, then nodded slowly. There's a storage facility. Not under his name, but it's where certain medical records are kept off the books. If those reports still exist, that's where you'll find them. But you didn't hear that from me. The journalist nodded, his mind already racing ahead. He had what he needed. A lead, a place to start. But as he stood to leave, the doctor grabbed his wrist, his grip tight. Be careful, he warned. You're not the first person who's tried to dig into things like this. But you might be the last if you don't watch your back. The words lingered as the journalist walked out into the night, his heart pounding in his chest. He had come looking for answers, and now he had them. But the closer he got, the more dangerous it became. He had a choice: walk away now while he still could, or push forward, knowing that once he stepped into the next phase of this investigation, there would be no turning back. But deep down, he already knew the answer. He wasn't walking away. Not now. Not when the truth was this close. And whoever was trying to stop him, they were about to find out just how far he was willing to go. The journalist could feel the weight of his own breath as he pulled up outside the storage facility. The night stretched long and silent around him, the air thick with something that wasn't quite fear but wasn't far from it either. The doctor's words echoed in his mind, the warning that had settled deep into his bones. If he stepped through those doors, if he found what he was looking for, there would be no undoing it. But that was the risk he had already accepted. The truth was too close now, and no amount of threats or shadowed warnings would stop him from pulling it into the light. He stepped out of the car, his heartbeat steady but deliberate as he moved toward the building. The facility was one of those anonymous, chain-link fence places that people used to store things they didn't want others to find. He had done his research before coming. The unit in question wasn't registered to Spence, nor to his team, but to a shell company linked to a name he had seen before, a medical consultant often hired by high-profile fighters. It was the kind of connection designed to be overlooked, to make it seem like there was nothing to find. But there was always something. As he reached the door, he glanced around, checking for any signs that he wasn't alone. The parking lot was empty, the security cameras too high to catch a clear look at his face in the dim light. He had come prepared, gloves to avoid leaving prints, a small flashlight tucked in his pocket. With a deep breath, he worked the lock. The storage unit door groaned as it lifted, revealing a space that looked ordinary at first glance: old filing cabinets, stacks of boxes, nothing that screamed conspiracy. But he had learned by now that the truth rarely sat in the open. It had to be dug out. He moved quickly, flipping through the cabinets, pulling open drawers, searching for anything that felt out of place. At first, it was the usual contracts, medical records for lesser-known fighters, documents meant to throw off anyone who didn't know exactly what they were looking for. But then, beneath a pile of old paperwork, he found it. A folder, thicker than the others, marked only by a date the month following Spence's accident. His fingers tightened around the edge as he pulled it free, flipping it open with a breath that felt heavier than before. The first few pages were routine medical evaluations, the kind meant for public record. But deeper inside, the story changed. Neurological assessments, balance tests, reaction time studies, documents that painted a picture vastly different from the one the world had been told. The reports confirmed what the cut man and the doctor had hinted at. The accident had done more than scar Spence's body, it had compromised him in ways that should have made fighting impossible. Symptoms: inconsistent reflexes, dizziness, cognitive delays. A recommendation from an initial specialist that Spence should be indefinitely sidelined. But then, abruptly, the reports shifted. A new evaluation from a different doctor, one hired directly by his management, stating that the previous assessments had been exaggerated. That Spence was fit to fight. That there was no risk. And just like that, the comeback had been greenlit. The journalist's chest tightened. This was it. The proof. The lie that had been spun for years, the gamble that had been taken with Spence's career, his health, his life. He pulled out his phone, snapping photos of every page, knowing he needed to move fast. He had expected to feel relief, some sense of victory at having found what he came for, but instead, there was something else, a cold awareness settling at the base of his spine. Because if this was here, if these files had been stored away instead of destroyed, then it meant someone had left them to be found. And that meant he wasn't the only one looking for them. A noise outside. A slow crunch of gravel underfoot. His pulse jumped. He shoved the folder back where he found it, closing the cabinet just as a shadow stretched across the open doorway. He turned sharply, his breath catching as a figure stepped inside. Not a hired thug, not some nameless enforcer sent to silence him. Someone familiar. Someone he never expected to see standing there. It was Spence himself. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Spence's expression was unreadable, his gaze flicking from the open cabinets to the journalist's face. Then, quietly, he asked, "Did you find what you were looking for?" The journalist's mouth was dry, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Why are you here?" Spence exhaled, stepping further inside, his posture calm but heavy with something unspoken. "Because I knew someone would come looking eventually." He glanced at the filing cabinets, at the hidden truths buried in paper and ink. "I didn't put that there. But someone wanted it to be found." His voice was quieter now, edged with something raw. "And I needed to know who." The journalist felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. "So you knew," he said slowly. "You knew they covered this up." Spence's jaw tightened. "I knew what they told me. What I wanted to believe." He hesitated, his eyes darkening. "But after a while, you stop asking questions. You stop wanting to know the answers." The journalist studied him, trying to piece it together. "Then why let me find this? Why not bury it completely?" Spence let out a breath, something like exhaustion washing over him. "Because I've spent years trying to outrun this. Fighting to prove it wasn't true. That I wasn't broken. That I was still who I used to be." He looked at the journalist then, his expression unreadable. "But maybe it's time people know the truth." The journalist wasn't sure what he had expected, but it wasn't this. It wasn't a man standing at the crossroads of his own career, his own legacy, deciding whether to keep the illusion alive or let it all come crashing down. He had come here to expose a cover-up, to reveal the lie that had been fed to the world. But now, standing here, facing the man at the center of it all, he realized the story wasn't his to tell. It was Spence's. The fighter turned toward the door, his silhouette sharp against the dim light outside. "You want to publish it, go ahead," he said, his voice steady. Maybe it's better that way. He paused, then glanced back. But if you do, just make sure you tell it right. Then he walked out, leaving the journalist alone with the weight of the truth. And for the first time since this all began, the journalist wasn't sure what he was going to do. The journalist stood there for a long time, staring at the empty space where Spence had just been. The night outside was still, but inside, everything felt like it was moving too fast. His pulse pounded in his ears as he looked down at his phone, the images of the medical files still glowing on the screen. Proof. Evidence. The very thing he had spent weeks chasing, the story he had risked everything to uncover. But now, in the silence of that storage unit, he felt the weight of it in a way he hadn't expected. This wasn't just about exposing a cover-up or revealing a scandal. This was about a man who had built his entire life around fighting, a man who had been told he couldn't anymore, who had chosen to believe otherwise because the alternative was too much to bear. This was about legacy, about identity, about the desperate, relentless pursuit of proving to the world and to himself that he was still who he had always been. He exhaled slowly, his mind racing as he lowered his phone. He had options now. He could go back, write the article, let the truth break into the world like a storm that no one saw coming. He could expose everyone, the doctors, the management, the decision-makers who had let this happen. He could show the world that Spence had been thrown into fights that should have never happened, that the risks had been ignored, that the man they watched in the ring was carrying more than just the weight of expectation, he was carrying the consequences of a decision he never should have had to make. And yet, the memory of Spence's voice lingered in his mind. The way he had stood there, looking at the truth he had spent years avoiding, and had simply said, "Maybe it's time people know." But was that really his choice to make? He ran a hand down his face, frustration and uncertainty warring inside him. He had chased this story because he thought the truth was the only thing that mattered. That if he could just find the missing pieces, if he could just pull them together, then everything would be clear. But now, standing at the end of it all, clarity was the last thing he had. He had spent so much time thinking about the story, about the way it would shake the boxing world, about how people would react, about how it would change everything. But had he thought enough about the man at the center of it? About what it meant for Spence to have this ripped from him, not in the way he had feared by an injury or by a loss but by the truth itself. The night felt heavier now, pressing down on him as he stepped out of the storage unit, locking the door behind him. The streets were quiet, the city humming with the distant sounds of life moving on, unaware of the storm that had just passed. He slipped into his car, gripping the steering wheel as he stared at his reflection in the rearview mirror. He had a choice to make. He had come this far. But for the first time, he wasn't sure if writing the story was the right choice anymore. The next day, he found himself outside the gym. Spence was inside, training. The sound of gloves against the heavy bag echoed through the open doors, sharp and relentless. The journalist hesitated before stepping in, watching for a moment as Spence worked his movements, calculated, powerful, the rhythm of a man who had spent his entire life perfecting the art of control. But there was something else there now. A weight that hadn't been there before. Maybe it had always been there, and he just hadn't seen it. Spence turned, wiping sweat from his brow, his expression unreadable as he met the journalist's gaze. He didn't look surprised to see him. Maybe he had been expecting this. Maybe he had been waiting. "You write it?" Spence asked, his voice steady. The journalist swallowed, shaking his head. "Not yet." He hesitated. "I don't know if I should." Spence studied him for a long moment before nodding slowly. He didn't ask why. He didn't try to convince him one way or another. He just leaned against the ropes, exhaling. "I don't know if it would change anything," he admitted, his voice quieter now. "People see what they want to see. They believe what they need to believe." He looked down at his wrapped hands, flexing his fingers. "Maybe I did too. The journalist sat on the edge of the ring, his hands clasped together. "I came into this thinking it was just about the truth," he admitted. "That if I found it, if I put it out there, it would fix things." He shook his head. "But maybe the truth isn't always about what people know. Maybe it's about what they choose to do with it." Spence nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Maybe," he said. "But sometimes you don't get to choose what people do with it once it's out there." The weight of that truth settled between them. The journalist had spent his entire career chasing stories, believing that exposure was always the right answer. That shining a light on the hidden things in the dark would always make things better. But now, for the first time, he wondered if that was really true. If maybe, just maybe, some truths weren't meant to be told in headlines. He stood, slipping his phone from his pocket one last time, staring at the photos of the files. Then, with a deep breath, he pressed a button. One by one, the images disappeared. Deleted. Gone. Spence watched him, his expression unreadable. "That easy, huh?" The journalist met his gaze. "No," he admitted. "Not easy." They stood there for a moment, two men at the end of a story either of them had expected to live. Then Spence nodded, turning back to the bag, resuming his training as if nothing had changed. But something had. Maybe it was just the knowledge that, for the first time in years, he wasn't running from the truth anymore. Maybe it was the relief of knowing that his story, his fight, was still his to tell. The journalist stepped outside, breathing in the crisp morning air, feeling the weight lift from his shoulders. He had come looking for the truth. And he had found it. But more than that, he had found something deeper. Something that couldn't be printed on a page or turned into a headline. He had found the understanding that sometimes, the most powerful stories aren't the ones we tell the world. They're the ones we carry with us, the ones that remind us of who we are, and the choices we make when no one else is watching. And as he walked away, leaving the past behind, he knew that this story, this truth, would stay with him forever.